Exhaustion that deep doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care that the man who finds you is the most dangerous man in the province. It doesn't care that the agency warned you twice, and the housekeeper once, to stay invisible in this house. When your body stops honoring your brain's instructions, it simply stops. Una Farrell stopped at 4:17 in the morning, on the cold hardwood floor of Bernard Hale's private medical suite, her back against the base of the nightstand, a pulse oximeter still clipped to her index finger. The monitor's soft green glow read 97. The old man was breathing. The crisis was over. She'd meant to stand up. That was 3 weeks of meaning to stand up. Una was 27 years old, a licensed practical nurse with a hospital day shift that started at 7 in the morning and ended at 5 in the afternoon. On the days she contracted with Meridian Care, which was every day now, she drove 2 hours north on the 400, past Barry, past the turnoff toward Midland, up the narrow county road that wound along the edge of Georgian Bay until she reached the iron gates of the Hale estate. She arrived every evening at 7:30. She left every morning at 6. She had been doing this for 43 days. Her brother, Alec, needed another 8 months of inpatient rehabilitation. The accident had left him with a spinal injury that the neurosurgeon described with careful, measured optimism. Careful, measured optimism cost $4,000 a month. Una's hospital salary covered rent and groceries. The Meridian contract covered Alec. She didn't think much beyond that anymore. Thinking too far ahead was a luxury for people who slept. She knew the Hale estate the way you know a place you've navigated in the dark for weeks. Not by sight, but by instinct. 15 steps from the back service entrance to the prep kitchen, 2 flights to the medical wing. The 3rd floorboard from the left on the upper landing creaked. She stepped over it without looking down. She knew that Bernard Hale, 71, former CEO of Hale Capital and current occupant of a hospital-grade bed in the East Wing, liked the blinds raised 2 inches above the sill before he slept, not more and not less. She knew he took his nebulizer treatment at 9, midnight and 4. She knew his COPD was advancing faster than the chart suggested, and that his son either didn't know or had chosen not to look at the numbers. Riordan Hale she knew almost nothing about, and she had decided that was a sound arrangement. The other nurses at the agency talked about him the way people talk about weather systems, with a mix of awe and careful distance. He was 38. He'd built Hale Capital from a regional land development firm into one of the largest private investment groups east of the Rockies. He had an office on Bay Street and a reputation in rooms Una had never entered and had no intention of entering. What she knew of him from 43 nights in his house was this. He arrived late and left early, moved through the corridors like he was calculating something perpetually, and never once came to check on his father. She thought about that sometimes, between the 2 a.m. nebulizer treatment and the 4 a.m. vitals check. She thought it was probably easier to build an empire than to sit at a dying man's bedside. She thought it without judgment. She had her own avoidance strategies. Tonight, Bernard had coded at 2:12. Not a full arrest, a severe bronchospasm that spiked his heart rate and dropped his oxygen into the low 80s before Una got the supplemental flow running and talked him through it, her voice low and steady the way she'd learned to keep it even when her own hands were shaking. By 3:45, he was sleeping. By 4:10, she had documented the episode, updated the care chart, and replaced the oxygen tank. She sat down in the hard wooden chair by the window to wait out the last hour of her shift. She told herself 10 minutes. Just until the numbers held. She slid down, and the floor came up to meet her, and then there was nothing. Riordan Hale had not planned to go to the medical wing. He had planned to pour 2 fingers of whiskey, review the quarterly security assessment that Croft had left on his desk, and not sleep until he'd accounted for every weak point the Renner Group might exploit before the weekend. It was a system. It had worked for 6 years. What had not been part of the system was his father's voice at 2 in the morning, thin and frightened, carrying through the ventilation shaft to his study directly below. He had heard it. He had sat at his desk and listened to the low, controlled murmur of the nurse's voice, bringing the old man back from wherever he'd been. He had not gone upstairs. He had poured the whiskey and stared at the wall until the sound stopped. He went upstairs at 4:30 because the house was quiet in a way that felt different from quiet. The medical suite smelled like antiseptic eucalyptus from the nebulizer, and faintly like cedar. Something warm underneath the clinical smell that didn't belong in the room. Riordan pushed the door open and stopped. His father was asleep, chest rising and falling with the slow mechanical steadiness of the oxygen feed. The monitor blinked green in the corner. On the floor beside the nightstand, curled on her side on the bare hardwood with her knees drawn up and one hand still loosely holding the pulse oximeter, was the nurse. He stood in the doorway for a long moment. He had registered her the way he registered all staff, peripherally, categorically. Brown hair usually pinned back, grey scrubs, sensible shoes that squeaked slightly on the tile. She never made eye contact, which he had interpreted as professional discretion. He had not looked at her long enough to notice that the skin under her eyes was bruised dark with missed sleep, or that her hands, even relaxed, had the careful stillness of someone who had been holding tension so long they'd forgotten how to fully release it. He crouched down. He said her name. She didn't stir. Her breathing was heavy and deep, the breathing of someone whose body had simply shut down the negotiations. He looked at the floor. He looked at the draft coming off the window and the thin cotton of her scrubs. He swore under his breath. Short, quiet, the kind of profanity you deploy at an inconvenient truth rather than a person. He gathered her up. She weighed almost nothing, which struck him as practical and wrong, in a way he didn't examine closely. She made a soft sound when he lifted her, not distress, something closer to relief, and her head settled against his shoulder without her waking. He carried her to the nearest guest suite in the east corridor, kicked the door open, and laid her on top of the duvet. He tried to pull his arm free. Her hands caught his wrist, both hands wrapped around him in a grip that was desperate and entirely unconscious, the grip of someone grabbing the only solid thing in a current. Riordan looked at her hands. He looked at her face. She was still asleep. He sat down in the chair by the bed. He told himself it was because he needed to confirm she hadn't hit her head on the nightstand. He sat there until the room lightened. Una woke in increments. The ceiling was wrong. Too high, too white. The pillow was wrong. Too thick, too expensive. There was no alarm, no blue pre-dawn chill, no sound of the night shift winding down 3 floors below. She was somewhere else entirely. 3 seconds of pure blank confusion before the previous night assembled itself in her memory. Bernard's episode, the floor, the 10 minutes she was only going to rest her eyes. She sat up, her right arm yanked tight. Una looked down. A hand. Large, the knuckles scarred, a flat matte watch at the wrist she recognized because she'd checked the time against it at midnight. Riordan Hale's hand, resting against the duvet, her fingers wrapped around it like she'd been trying to keep him from leaving. The heat that moved up her neck was equal parts embarrassment and dread. Riordan was in the chair beside the bed. He was awake. He was watching her with the particular quality of attention she imagined he deployed at boardroom tables, and in negotiations she would never know the details of, absolute and steady and giving nothing away. "I can explain," Una said. "Can you?" His voice was flat from disuse, low in the early morning quiet. "I was treating your father through a bronchospasm. I sat down to wait out the post-episode observation window. I fell asleep on the floor." She kept her voice professionally level. She was very good at professionally level. "I apologize for the inconvenience, if you'll." She tried to slide her fingers free from his wrist. He didn't pull away. He also didn't grip harder. He simply didn't move. "You've been working double shifts," he said. It wasn't a question. Una looked at his collarbone. "My contract with Meridian specifies overnight availability, which I provide. My hospital employment is outside the scope of that contract." "That's not an answer." "No, Mr. Hale, it isn't." She looked back at him. Her cynicism had burned through most of her capacity for fear months ago, around the time the third collections agency had called about Alec's hospital bills. Fear was expensive. She couldn't afford it. "Are you going to terminate the contract? Because if you are, I'd rather know now so I can contact the agency before the penalty window closes." Something moved across his face. Not softness, something harder than softness but adjacent to it. "I'm not terminating the contract," Riordan said. He stood, releasing her wrist, or rather simply ceasing to hold it, which was a different thing. He moved toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped without turning. "Eat something. Croft will bring whatever you need from the kitchen." He left. Una sat in the middle of the enormous bed and listened to the silence close back in around her. She had not been fired. She did not understand why. She folded this fact carefully away and went back to work. What Riordan had pulled from Croft by noon was this. Una Farrell had graduated with distinction from nursing school 4 years ago. Clean record. No debt of her own creation. Her brother, Alec, had been struck by a vehicle on the Gardner Expressway 14 months ago. The driver had been uninsured. Alec's spinal rehabilitation, ongoing, non-negotiable if he was going to walk again, was being funded entirely by Una through a combination of her hospital salary, the Meridian contract, and a line of credit she'd opened with a bank that charged interest at a rate that made Riordan's jaw tighten. The Meridian contract was the particular problem. He read through it twice. It required a 90-day minimum commitment, non-negotiable, with a financial penalty for early exit that would consume approximately 6 weeks of Una's combined take-home pay. It required her on-site by 7:30 p.m., and not provision for travel time. No overnight accommodation required from the estate, no sick days. He read the accommodation clause 3 times. She had been driving 4 hours a day, every day, for 43 days, on top of a 10-hour hospital shift, and caring for his father through the nights in between. Riordan set the folder down. Outside, Georgian Bay was going dark under the November overcast, the temperature on the gauge reading -9. "Does she know I've seen this?" he asked. "No," Croft said. "Good." Riordan stood. "Buy out the Meridian contract. Full penalty paid today. Find out the outstanding balance on her brother's rehabilitation facility." He picked up his jacket. "Cover the next 8 months." Croft was quiet for a moment in the particular way that meant he was choosing which objection to voice. "She's going to ask why." "Yes," Riordan said, "she is." He walked out without answering, which was, in his world, the same thing as answering honestly. She asked him that evening, in the corridor outside Bernard's suite. She had the look of someone who had been rehearsing the conversation. Spine straight, voice controlled, the careful neutrality she probably used with difficult patients and billing departments. "I know about the contract," Una said. "I know you paid it out." "Yes. You had no reason to do that." "I had several." Riordan leaned against the wall across from her. The hallway was narrow, and the space between them felt smaller than the distance actually was. "You're the best person my father's had in that room in 2 years. His compliance on the treatment schedule has gone up 30% since you started. From a purely operational standpoint, I can't afford to lose you to a poorly written service agreement." Una looked at him for a long moment. She had grey eyes, he noticed, with the particular direct quality of someone who's spent a great deal of time deciding whether the information they were receiving was true. "And Alex's rehabilitation," she said. "A separate matter. It wasn't in the operational calculus." "No," Riordan said, "it wasn't." The silence between them was careful and even. "What do I owe you?" Una asked. "Nothing. That's not how it works. It is in this house." He pushed off the wall. "There's a room in the nurses' quarters that's been empty since June. Move in at the end of the week. The commute is over." He paused. "Unless you have an objection." She had 7 objections. She went through them later, sitting on the edge of the guest bed with her phone in her hands and Alex's voice on the other end of the line, warm and steadier than it had been in months. And she still couldn't make any of them feel more important than the alternative. She moved in at the end of the week. Living inside the Hale estate was like learning a language no one had agreed to teach you. She learned it, the way she'd always learned things, through careful, sustained attention to the things people left behind when they weren't performing. She learned that Riordan drank black coffee at 5 in the morning and tea at midnight, the specific kind with the yellow tin, and that he would rather throw away a mug than rinse it without reason. She learned that he visited his father every night, but only after she had dimmed the lights and stepped out. Never while she was in the room, as if witnessing the vulnerability of the gesture was a transaction he wasn't prepared to make in front of anyone. She learned that he paced when he was managing something he couldn't solve by force. Slow circuits of the upper landing at 3 in the morning, his footsteps barely audible on the runner. She learned that the particular set of his shoulders told you more than his face did, and that the one expression she couldn't fully read, the one that appeared and was gone before she was certain she'd seen it, happened when he thought she wasn't looking. One night in December, she was restocking the medication cabinet in the prep room adjacent to the medical suite. The door pulled half-closed behind her. When she heard the suite door open and Riordan's voice, not the voice he used in the hallway or on the phone or in the brief, efficient exchanges they conducted about care schedules and supply orders, a different register entirely. Low and with the rough texture of something unshielded. He was talking to his father. The old man was asleep. It didn't seem to matter. Una kept her back to the door. She finished counting the ampoules of salbutamol with careful, absolute concentration. She didn't move until she heard the suite door close again, and then she stood with her hands on the cabinet shelf in the dark prep room and said nothing to no one. The next morning on her medication prep table, there was a coffee in a cardboard sleeve from a bakery whose name she recognized, a town 40 minutes south, nowhere near the estate. It was her order, the one she'd told no one about, the one she'd mentioned in passing to Alec on a call 2 months ago. There was no note. There never was. The night the Renner group made their move, the bay froze early, and the temperature dropped to -22. Una knew something was wrong from the number of vehicles on the grounds. The security detail doubled at the gates. Croft moving through the lower floors with the focused restraint of someone managing a very specific kind of emergency. Bernard picked up on it. The ill sometimes did. Some frequency of tension in the house that bypassed language, and by midnight his oxygen numbers had dipped to 91. Una stayed at his side, kept the flow at 2 liters, and talked him through it, low and steady, the same way she always did. At 1:40 he finally settled. At 2:15, the private entrance to the east wing opened with a sound she hadn't heard before. She stepped into the corridor and Riordan walked, dragged himself out of the stairwell. His jacket was gone. The left side of his dress shirt was saturated, dark and wet in the emergency lighting, and it was dripping onto the hardwood floor in a steady, rhythmic pattern. Mr. Hale. "Go back to the suite," he said, his voice tight and controlled in the way of someone managing acute pain through sheer refusal to acknowledge it. "You're bleeding." Astute. He took another step and caught himself against the wall with his right hand, leaving a dark print on the pale plaster. Una closed the distance between them before she'd consciously decided to. "If you pass out in this hallway, I cannot move you. You're twice my size. We're both stuck here until morning." She got her shoulder under his right arm. "Walk. Prep room, now." He looked it back. Something in him ran the calculation and then, simply, gave it up. He walked. She got him seated on the prep table and cut the shirt open because the buttons were beyond both their patience. The wound was a lateral laceration, jagged-edged and deep, a knife pulled across the left side of his abdomen just below the ribs. It needed a trauma surgeon and a properly equipped room. It had Una, a portable suture kit, and a cabinet of medical supplies she maintained with borderline excessive thoroughness. "I can close this," she said. "It's going to hurt." "I know." "Who did this?" "That's not a clinical question." "It isn't." She reached for the saline. "Hold the table." He held the table. When she irrigated the wound, his whole body went rigid, and a sound came out of him that was not a word. Involuntary, compressed, gone almost before it existed. His right hand found her hip and gripped, grounding himself against the pain. She didn't stop. She packed the wound, pinched the edges, applied the surgical closures with the speed and precision of someone who had done worse in worse conditions. She wrapped the pressure dressing with more force than was strictly standard and stepped back. Her hands were shaking. It was delayed. The shaking always came after, when the thing that needed doing was done. She looked at her hands and breathed through it. "Look at me," Riordan said. His voice had changed. The authority was still there, but something underneath it had shifted. The control stripped just far enough by pain and blood loss that she could hear what was actually under it. She looked up. "You held," he said. Direct, the same way he said everything, except quieter. "I'm a nurse," Una said. Her voice was steadier than her hands. "That's what nurses do." "No," he shook his head slightly. "That's what you do. Other people would have run." She didn't have an answer for that. She cleaned the blood from his forearm with a warm cloth, methodical and careful, because it was easier than looking at his face. When she finished, she reached for the used materials. His hand came down over her wrist, not gripping, just resting. The weight of it stopped her completely. "My father," he said. "Stable. 94 last reading. He's sleeping." "And you?" The question surprised her. She looked at him. He was watching her with that particular quality of attention she still didn't fully have a name for. The kind that didn't need anything back, just looked, without agenda, without the slight performance most people maintained even in their most unguarded moments. "I'm fine," she said. "You've been awake for 20 hours. 19. A fractional, soundless thing happened at the corner of his mouth. "Sit with him. I'll take the other chair." "You've lost blood. You should." "I'll take the other chair," Riordan said. "Sit with him, Una." It was the first time he'd used her name like that, not the formal address, not the half-second recognition of passing her in the hall, but just her name, dropped into the room without weight or ceremony, the way you say the name of someone whose presence you've simply gotten used to needing. She went and sat in the wooden chair by Bernard's bed. Riordan lowered himself into the opposite chair with the careful deliberateness of someone managing fresh pain, and he didn't make a sound doing it. For a long time, the only sounds in the room were the oxygen monitor, and the wind off the bay and the slow, regular breathing of Bernard Hale, who slept through all of it the way very old men sometimes sleep, profoundly, as though the world and its complications were occurring in a register just slightly below his concern. Una was asleep before she knew she was tired. The chair was hard and the room was warm, and the numbers on the monitor were good, and her body simply decided it had earned this. It happened the way it always happened, without asking permission. She woke to grey morning light off the ice on the bay, and the first thing she was aware of was warmth. Specific warmth. She looked down. Riordan's hand was resting over hers on the arm of the chair. His fingers loose, not gripping, more like something placed carefully, set down with attention. The way you set down something you've been carrying for a long time and are afraid to put weight on for fear of what it means. He was asleep in the opposite chair with his head against his forearm and the dressing on his side still clean and white in the morning light. The monitor beeped softly 95. Una looked at his hand over hers. She looked at his face in sleep, the lines and angles of it, the vigilance that occupied it so completely when he was awake, and that was right now simply absent. He looked younger. He looked like a man who had run out of something and set it down for an hour. She knew that feeling. She had been living inside it for 14 months. She didn't move her hand. She sat with the morning light coming through the window and her patient breathing steadily beside her, and Riordan Hale's fingers resting over hers across the arm of a chair in a room where, 3 months ago, she had been an invisible contractor with a clipboard and an exit strategy. The sensible thing would have been to pull away before he woke, to restore the distance, to go back to being what she'd been, efficient and professional and completely unreachable, the way you learned to be when you couldn't afford to lose anything else. She didn't move. She was still there when he woke, and he went very still when he saw his hand over hers, and then, as if it were a question and she had answered it simply by staying, he didn't move either. Outside, the bay ice held. The wind had dropped sometime in the night. The world was very quiet and very cold, and Una Farrell, who had driven 4 hours a day for 43 days to keep her brother alive and asked for nothing from anyone, sat in a hard wooden chair in a room that smelled like antiseptic and cedar and found that she had somehow, without planning it, stopped running. She'd come here to survive. She'd been very good at surviving. She hadn't expected to find, in the most unlikely possible place, someone who understood exactly what that cost, and who had stayed beside her in the dark anyway, not asking for anything back.